A collective gasp ripped through the cathedral-like ballroom the moment she stepped into the frame. It arrived like a single, inhaled note on audience united in shock, then hung, taut and tremulous, under the chandelier's cold light, all eyes tilted upward to the sweeping staircase. At the top stood Betty. Not a revenant, but a monarch, wrapped in molten gold that moved like melted sunlight. The gown was worth $2 million. It read like armor and currency at once. It was everything he had assumed she would never be again. If you want to see how this unfolds, subscribe. This is the part you don't want to miss. 10 years earlier, the office where they signed the papers was small and antiseptic, its windows pretending to overlook a skyline that belonged to someone else. Matthew slid the cream-colored divorce packet across the table as if it were a menu. He had the arrogance of someone who believed spectacle to be a weapon. A public dismissal, an erasure, performed with a smile. He told her, politely and precisely, that the headlines would make his life easier without the story of the woman who preferred the basement lab to the ballroom. Betty listened. She had already built the foundation of his empire with long nights and whiteboard diagrams, with the early patents no one read properly, and the prototypes nobody else trusted. Matthew had been the face. She had been the architecture hidden under drywall. He had rebranded her labor into his charisma, then walked away and handed the label to another woman who smelled like citrus and new leather. Chloe, whose pulse matched the glossy magazine profiles. Chloe came with candles and clients, and the kind of laugh that translated well into selfie clips. She glossed over the parts of Matthew's life that required patience, and she allowed the narrative to be simple. The genius and his muse. Matthew liked being simple. Complexity was exhausting. He wanted adoration, not explanation. He wanted applause, not truth. He meant to humiliate Betty with the wedding invitation. He assumed she would decline or not appear at all. He imagined her dwindled into obscurity on inconvenient footnote. In his origin story, he could picture the toast to new beginnings, and the chambered laughter that would make her absence speak the words he preferred. He miscalculated. In the months before the ceremony, Betty moved like a ghost through a different kind of ledger. She did not shout her assets. She accessed them with fingers that had learned to hide in plain sight. The little accounts that fed the early patents registered under a shell company whose paper trail stopped where she wanted it to stop. Small dividends that fed into a private vault. The money had been quiet, and the patents had been smuggled between code and prototype before they became headlines. It wasn't theft. It was the labor of a decade housed inside agreements Matthew had never read because he never needed to. He liked the idea of victory more than the technicalities of creation. Betty hired an artisan, not a designer with glossy names and runway promises, but a maker who understood weight and structure, who had spent his life forging unusual things from rare metals. He called himself a sculptor. She called him, at dawn. She didn't ask for a dress. She asked for an object that would carry gravity. "I don't want a dress," she said the first time they met. "I want something forged in the sun." He took measurements, with the solemnity of someone measuring armor. He selected fabrics that behaved like liquid and metal woven threads that caught light and held it. The ensemble would be tailored to move the way a living creature moves. Fluid, inexorable, impossible to ignore. They discussed texture in terms of architecture. The seams would read like beams. The bodice would recall a rib cage. The skirt, the molten sweep of a city bank. The price came in like an afterthought, $2 million, because her money never advertised itself, and because the best things she had learned were not about numbers but about leverage. It was not vanity that bought the gown. It was strategy. A $2 million dress didn't just cover a body. It rerouted attention. It created demand, and then redirected it. She rehearsed only once. She practiced the unremarkable discipline of standing still and letting the room come to her. She tuned her attention to the small things, the ping of a cuff, the whisper of a silk strap, the echo of heels on marble that, would swell into a symphony when the hush came. Matthew spent the week before the wedding practicing his smile. He practiced the performance of being Unravel. He sat in interviews and described his success as inevitable, predetermined. He wanted a simple narrative. Utterly clever. Utterly secure. He did not expect foundations to be tested by appearances. The adjectives he used for the day were triumphant, immaculate, final. Chloe prepared like someone moving into a stage role, wearing the right dress and the right expressions, rehearsed to answer the camera when the spotlight hit. On the evening of the wedding, the ballroom smelled of lilies and expensive things pretending to be effortless. Crystal lights had been dimmed, so that the chandelier threw halos onto the crowd. A string quartet played a piece that sounded like a memory. Guests arrived in curated halos. Hedge fund names, PR magnates, pitch-perfect spouses, who had practiced idle interest for years. Betty's arrival cut the room in two. The doors opened and the top of the staircase framed a silhouette that the crowd did not expect to meet. For a suspended beat, the room forgot to breathe. Light pooled around her like oil on water. The gold of the gown didn't merely catch light. It contained it. It was as if she wore sun in a seam. He watched first. Matthew's smirk was a branch ready to snap under weight. He had imagined the narrative. She would arrive small, apologetic in a sensible dress, a footnote for the night's story about him. Instead, when the gown flowed down the stairs, his certainty slipped. Chloe's composure was the next casualty. She had rehearsed graciousness and the right way to clap, the right angle for a camera flash. Her mascara began to tremble when the silk gathered at Betty's hips. The dress moved like a living currency, weighty and quiet. The kind of thing rich with meanings beyond fabric. $2 million in a gown is a headline. $2 million carried by the woman you slight is an indictment, the guests whispered. Phones hovered like moths. Somewhere in the back, a socialite's laughter mingled with a gasp and fell away. There was an audible shift in the ballroom's gravitational pull. He could see it in the way alliances rearranged themselves like chairs at a table. Matthew's voice was loud enough for the tier below him. Betty, he said, gilded sarcasm and theatrical courtesy wrapped in one. Two, what do we owe the pleasure? He meant to shame her with his choice of words. He had practiced the cadence that would make her presence seem unseemly. A misstep that would confirm his expectation that she had been in the wrong all along. Betty descended the stairs with the composure of someone who had never for an instant believed he had owned her life. She couldn't erase the past. She had never tried, but she would redirect the present. She paused halfway down, as if to examine the room. The seam of the gown caught a light, and threw it, like a coin. It made the smile on Chloe's face look thin. Betty's voice was soft when she spoke, but it held a steel that made the air around the words weighty. Matthew, she said. No flourish. No anger. This dress was a collaboration. He blinked as if the word confused him. Collaboration. Credit. The basic notion that work had come from more hands than his. He had never been good at ascribing effort to others unless it made him bigger. Isn't this a lovely bit of theater? Matthew continued, trying out a cordial tone that was brittle. He had placed his bets on the night's narrative, and was unsettled to find the deck reshuffling itself beneath his fingers. Practice of humility. A cameo. A murmur went through the room. The quartet's piece became background noise. Eyes shifted toward the VIP table where, against the darkness of a tuxedo, a man sat with an expression that suggested he had been watching long before any of them had noticed. He was not a man who drew attention. He was the kind of presence that rearranged it. Men whispered his name in different corners of the city's underbelly. Guy Young? In certain circles he was an arbiter, a patron, a dealer in favors and fortunes. He wore discretion like a suit. Guy Young's attention had followed Betty's descent with the slow interest of someone cataloging assets. He lifted his glass once, a small, economical movement. He had not applauded. He did not need to. His eyes informed the room that a decision was taking place there. In a place far deeper than the social gossip of the night. Matthew felt the change. He frowned, the small reptiles of panic skittering across his face. He had secured patrons who preferred headlines. He had allies who loved the glare. He had never prepared for the quiet hand that could decouple applause from influence. She always did like being dramatic, Chloe said under her breath, an attempt to reclaim the moment by marking Betty as theatrical rather than essential. But the word didn't land. Betty's drama was not a spectacle for ego. It was a strategy. Guy Young rose slowly from his chair, an action that bent the room's attention toward him like gravity. He moved without haste because haste suggests nerves, and he likes nothing that smells of nerves. He walked toward the stairs, with the unobtrusive authority of someone who carried the city's ledger in a pocket he never revealed. Matthew tried to interpose himself. "Guy?" he said, sounding like a man who had arranged for a favorable smile from this exact man before. "We're all celebrating tonight. This is not the time." Guy's voice cut him off. It was a voice used to getting the last word without needing it. "Isn't it always surprising what some people think they can own?" Guy said. He let the word own hover. A hush dropped, like a curtain. Guy's words had the weight of a room's rumor, condensed into cadence. He turned, and in that pivot, there was a quiet clarity, addressed to the assembly more than to Matthew. "Some foundations are visible now, because someone decided to show the seams," he said. "All I ever care about is the foundation." The room tilted. People began to recollect small memories. A founder's offhand arrogance, a bubbly PR piece about being a solo genius, the contradictory notes about who had actually driven the early architecture. Favors flip like currency when holders discover that the underlying math has changed. Without theatrics, Guy removed a thin envelope from his inside jacket. It was a symbolic gesture, an offering, but people leaned in as if it were a legal tome. He stepped to the nearest microphone, allowing the fabric of his voice to reach the rows. "I funded ventures based on foundations," he said. "I withdraw my backing from whoever would pretend the foundation was not laid." It was a sentence that could have been dry, and it wasn't only because of its content. It landed because of the timing. He could have recused himself. He chose to act. The room's alliances are not built on principle so much as perception. Investors, patrons, social partners, these were the gears of Matthew's public engine. Guy's words nudged the levers. Someone at the back of the room, a venture partner who had once smiled for Matthew at an IPO party, found his phone. The chatter began to thrum. People checked their feeds. A reporter's pen faltered. In minutes, visibility shifted into practical consequence. Inquiries cold and polite. A quiet unasking of favors. Matthew's text chain filled with ellipses and then silence. "Are you seriously doing this?" Matthew asked, venom finally finding a voice. It was not a man who had ever been accustomed to being sidelined before a crowd. Rage tried to fill the vacuum, and sounded small. Guy looked at Matthew with something like pity. "I always went where the work was real," he said. "You made it a face." Faces change, foundations don't. The phrase landed like a verdict, without judge or jury. The crowd moved toward the slow consensus that Matthew's image was not the same as the architecture that supported it. People recalibrated their positions. They are opportunists by profession. When an asset's owners shift, the market follows, without moral notice. Chloe's smile had been the last thing holding his narrative together. Now the smile cracked. She stepped back, her hands searching for a script that no longer existed, makeup brimmed at the lash line. Her breath shortened in a way strangers would later remark on as her collapse under exposure. The rest of the room's behavior resembled animals leaving a scent. No dramatic shouting. No slanderous hiss. The elite know better than to commit social errors in public. Their abandonments are surgical and silent. Invitations dried up. Mentions smoothed away. The photographers who had once angled flashlights at the couple now angled their lenses toward the unfolding discomfort with the hungry detachment of their trade. Somewhere, a financier sent a terse message indicating a pause on transfers. A board member left in early. A PR flack, who had attended because image demands it, found a reason to step outside. The noise that had once affirmed Matthew's social capital dissolved. Matthew could feel his orbit slackening, his phone turning cold in his palm. Betty watched every inch of it, like a strategist watching a chessboard. She did not smile. She did not gloat. The moment was not about his suffering. It was about a necessary realignment of credit and power. She had no desire to rub salt into wounds. Cruelty would hollow the victory. After Gaz's intervention, a different kind of announcement unfurled. Discreet acknowledgments of prior contracts and patents, phrased in a way that suggested legalities and respect but conveyed one clear fact. Betty's name was attached to early registrations and technical designs that had been essential to Matthew's company's products. The documents were handled with the calm precision of an organization accustomed to preserving reputations until preserving them ceases to be profitable. A lobbyist at a nearby table murmured to a hedge fund partner, "We thought we were investing in the brand. Turns out, we invested in the backbone." Gossip has a currency of its own. Chloe could not contain the tremor. She fled toward a service door, mascara leaving rivers beneath her eyes. Her exit was not loud. It was public, and it was final in a way that needs no shouting. A woman who had bet her public persona on being the image of someone else's success was now The social cameras followed her for a beat, then slid back to the main event out of obligation. People waited to see if Matthew would collapse, to see if he would attempt salvage by humiliation. He tried to find a performance that would make the facts tolerable. He raised his voice, buying for himself that old familiar stage. "This is theater," he said. "Drama for cameras." It was a poor attempt to turn the room's attention into pity. Pity is a currency the elite seldom spend. Betty moved as a woman who had learned to translate patience into timing. She allowed the moment to breathe, until it had filled itself with consequence. She crossed the room, on soft heels that spoke a measured rhythm. Her gown whispered against marble, as if it were carrying the weight of all the unrecognized labor she had put into the world. It was a dress, yes, and it was a ledger, an asset displayed at an intersection of fashion and signal. She stopped a respectful distance from where Guy had stood. Her eyes found his, and for an instant, the world reduced to the exchange of two people who understood markets that were not entirely lawful, but were always transactional. Guy's intervention had been devastating for Matthew, because Guy measured returns in a way that made social capital and money indistinguishable. He held the lever of patronage, and knew how to move it. "You don't have to thank me," Guy said later, when a few remaining insiders had drifted enough to make the exchange private, but still public enough to be noticed. "I don't do charity. I do business." Betty's answer was pragmatic. "Nor would I expect it. I prefer deals that are precise." They spoke of many things without speaking of everything that had consented them. Their conversation was a negotiation disguised as a courtesy. Betty accepted his arm when he offered it, not because she needed the protection, but because the public image of a woman escorted by an influential man resets expectations in a different ledger. It signals that one is back in a network where decisions are contagious. She made no alliances out of gratitude. Her acceptance was measured. There was no romanticism in it. Guy Young was not a savior. He was a stakeholder. He was a man who read investments like texts, and liked profit, control, and leverage, in that order. Betty respected the efficiency of his motives because hers were efficient too. Outside the ballroom, in the glow of the city's night, flashes painted the marble steps. Reporters adjusted their cameras, for the record. Someone would later call it a scene of poetic irony. The woman who had been cut from the biography now re-entered it, as the person who had always been indispensable. the narrative shift would ripple out into headlines and op-eds. The opinion columnists, who had once proclaimed Matthew as a self-made man, would now parse pronouncements about teamwork and hidden geniuses. Those are the kinds of moral gymnastics that late capitalism undertakes. In the face of inconvenient truths, Matthew's public persona frayed over the next days in the way that an image with no foundation does, quickly, and with a particular kind of humiliation reserved for those who rely on applause over craft. A few of his former board members held a meeting. They said the right things about transparency. Investors reassessed risk. Invitations dried up like leaves in early frost. The city that had once cheered at his name learned to occupy other interests. Betty's phone, for once, did not ring with congratulations. The pleasures of vindication were not as satisfying as the relief at being in control. She spent the night looking through the documents that had been quietly registered in years past. She read names and clauses she had arranged to be obscure. Her life had been a catalogue of details. Now, those details were visible. That visibility would cost her Reese's attention, an enemy's butt. It gave her something else she had not had in a long time. The map of her own work. There is a loneliness to being right in a room that expects spectacle. People came to her with tentative apologies. Others offered performative warmth. She accepted neither warmth nor apologies more than she needed. There was a quiet, almost practical empathy in her behavior, a recognition that social life is transactional, and that fairness has no obligation to be dramatic. In the weeks after the wedding, Matthew reconstructed his life into a smaller narrative. He moved apartments, made controlled statements, and hired new consultants to shape a story of resilience. Chloe, for her part, withdrew from social media and made apologies in the form of quiet privacy. The cameras lost interest when fresh intrigues presented themselves. People move from shock to novelty with a speed that can make moral reckoning feel like a bad memory. Guy Young's engagement with Betty remained public only enough to matter. He arranged meetings that smelled less of malice than commerce. A dinner where terms were measured in compliments and substantive phrases. A quiet agreement that redistributed certain lines of influence. He did not promise redemption. He offered an opening. He was explicit in his terms. He would redirect patronage and backing to ventures where the real foundations were visible. And he expected a fair return. Betty negotiated with the same methodical patience she'd used to build the thing in the first place. She accepted his arm at the wedding not as a surrender to power, but as an acknowledgement that power can be amplified by partnerships that don't pretend to be virtuous. She understood the moral ambiguity in what she was choosing. Power, she knew, does not come with a morality clause. It is what one does with it afterward that determines the narrative. For the people who observed from the periphery, the image of Betty leaving arm in arm with Guy Young was unsettling. Some called it the moment she sold her soul. Others saw it as a pragmatic match of need and capacity. For Betty, it was neither sale nor salvation. It was a repositioning. She had no illusions about the types of favors Guy could call in. She had built her life on technical mastery. But she had learned that mastery converts into influence only when someone recognizes it as such. Her exit from the ballroom was deliberately unassailable. Gold against black suit. A measured smile that did not invite intimacy. The cameras loved the symmetry on image, ripe for thumbnails. But image is shallow. It does not account for the small, organizing decisions beneath it. Who pays who? Where patents are registered? What gets the first right of refusal? These things happened in rooms with curtains and in documents with watermarks. They were necessary, quiet, and often morally ambiguous. Betty's ascendance did not look like triumph in the movies. It looked like the patient rearrangement of power. She kept her dignity, because dignity is not the same as mercy. She did not revel in Matthew's ruin. She had no appetite for public cruelty. The stakes for her were different. Recognition, restoration, control over her own work. That could not be done through spectacle alone. It required legal clarity, public backing, and an alliance pragmatic enough to secure real influence. Months later, their city would recalibrate around new facts. Old conferences would add panels on founder fatigue and the invisible labor behind icons. Magazine writers would tangle with the nuance of where credit is due. Socialites who mistook face for foundation would learn, one by one, the perils of forgetting the scaffolding that keeps public figures aloft. In quieter corners, Betty continued to build. She sat in labs and white rooms, taking the kind of notes that are invisible to broad audiences, but essential to production. She accepted an armature of influence that allowed her to convert craft into scale without surrendering authorship. She ignored the voices that wanted her revenge to be loud. She'd always preferred the steady accumulation of leverage. Patience had been her craft. What remained between her and Matthew was a civility that had thinned into formality. They were two people who had once shared a business, and found their roles diverged. Where he had sought applause, she had sought structure. Where he had cultivated image, she had cultivated systems. The wreckage of one life became the scaffold for another. He would find his new path, shaped by the consequences he had earned. She would continue to work in the places where quiet power is made visible. The city would tell the story in pieces, in think pieces, in gossip columns, in a few polite interviews where both parties avoided the sorts of details that hurt. The opera of their lives would keep parts of itself private, because some truths are too practical, too stern for headlines that prefer melodrama. At the center of the conversation remained the $2 million gown. It had succeeded beyond fashion. It had become a language. It spoke of value, not just monetary, but symbolic. Who is visible, who is recognized, who gets to build, and who is credited. People argued about the ethics of using fashion as a device. Some said it was a spectacle unworthy of resolve. Others argued that the stage is where reputations are tested. If the truth can only be told with drama, then drama becomes a necessary tool. Betty had chosen her tools with care. She had not sought to bloody anyone. She had sought a restoration, measured and enduring. The dress, the public intervention, the patronage, these were instruments in a longer-term strategy. She would not allow herself the small consolation of petty vengeance. Her pleasure was steadier, colder. It was the satisfaction of seeing architecture acknowledged as architecture. There was a question that followed the event in the city's quieter corridors. What does it mean to ally with someone like Guy Young? People asked in tones that ranged from moral outrage to opportunistic curiosity. Betty did not answer these questions in tweets or interviews. She answered them in the choices she made afterward. She chose to marry her technical expertise with the kinds of influence that could scale it safely and decisively. Whether one calls that compromise or pragmatism depends on the moral language you prefer. Guy Young's intervention had cost Matthew's social currency. It had given Betty leverage. The Custer Guy was the consolidation of influence in a way that made him a stakeholder in something he would profit from, certainly, but also something he respected because it had substance. He liked things that produced returns and sustained power. Betty's work did both. There is a particular kind of triumph that is neither vengeful nor performative. It is precise, efficient, and thoughtful. That was the arc Betty engineered. She had been discarded and used as a backdrop long enough. She reclaimed her name and attached to it the affairs that proved her worth. She recoded narrative with evidence. In her exit from the wedding, she did not cry. She did not shout. She walked. She did not leave any body in ruins. For the sake of spectacle, she rearranged the social calculus so that it reflected reality more closely. In the months that followed, the city watched to see how durable the change would be. Alliances reshuffled as people calculated where advantage would be. The notion of what constitutes a founder's story shifted, not through a single headline but by the slow accretion of recognition. Patents acknowledged, boards reconstituted, investors asking different questions. People adjusted their definitions of success to accommodate the truth that architecture matters. Betty's life moved forward on multiple levels. she had access to influence that allowed her to protect her designs and to scale the work she believed in. She accepted Ga Young's arm as a public sign and his patronage as a tool. Nothing less. It was a partnership arranged in the gray of necessity, an alliance for effectiveness rather than ideology. When the night rolled fully into memory, and the fashion commentary faded into the city's constant hum, the image that stuck was deceptively simple. Gold against black, a woman who had been overlooked walking beside a man who measured returns and favors. The image begged moral interpretation. Some saw it as the woman who sold out, others saw it as the woman who reclaimed what was hers. By any practical means necessary, neither assessment told the whole story. Betty knew this, and preferred it. Power, she had learned, is rarely clean. It is often messy, negotiated in back rooms, and in contracts, in quiet evenings, where terms are agreed upon without cameras. She had learned to accept moral ambiguity when it produced results that protected her work and gave her agency to continue building. For Matthew, the consequences were immediate and painful. Social invitations dried up, backing evaporated in quiet messages. The image of control he had cultivated unraveled because it had been built on a misattribution of labor. That unraveling left him with two choices: rebuild in humility and truth, or sink into a smaller world, where the applause might still be manufactured, but would never be the same. He chose, as people often do, to rebuild in ways easier to maintain with smaller crowds. And Chloe, she learned that being the image without being the builder leaves you vulnerable. She retreated into privacy and reflection. For a while, she became a study in the costs of attaching one's dignity to someone else's narrative. Betty walked away from the wedding with the public satisfaction of a measured victory and the private continuation of work that had always mattered to her. She did not take joy in anyone's downfall. She took care. That was the point. Power without care is mere force. Power with care is an architecture of sustained intent. If you were surprised by how the night turned, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The end was not a neat moral. It was not a Hollywood denouement. It was a reallocation of influence, quiet, effective, and necessary. In a city that worships image, she had used image as one of many tools to make reality match the truth. The $2 million gown was an instrument, not the motive. The real story was what it revealed: that the hands who build real things deserve to be seen, and that sometimes, to be seen, those hands must learn to speak in the language of spectacle, influence, and grim pragmatism. Betty left, arm-linked with a man whose methods she neither idealized nor romanticized. She stepped into a future composed of both possibility and moral compromise, because sometimes surviving and making things that matter require a hand extended from the shadows. And for the rest of us, the story is a lesson. Foundations are not always visible, but they are the true currency of power. Remember that when you find yourself applauding a face